Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Echoes of Shattered Destiny. Episode 28. Let's take a minute. I need a breather before I tear her heart out. I hissed over Mind Link. The darkness in my veins was crooning, kill her, kill her, kill her. The possibility that she'd open her mouth again and say something that eroded the last shred of my willpower was terrifying enough to make me want to run. Still holding Maddox's hand, I pulled him away from Rowena. The traitor was reclined in her seat, lazy smile on her face. She could act like being here was her choice, like this was some five-star resort, but I had a feeling she'd quickly change her mind once Maddox began drawing blood. The mere thought of hearing her screams had my hands shaking, twitching with the urge to let my magic take control. There was clear reluctance on Maddox's end, but he relented and let me lead him into the observation room. As Rowena's cell door swung shut, I closed in on my mate. The others in the room faded into the background, the prickling sensation that was their eyes smothered by fear. I fumbled to grab both of his hands, capturing them with my own so that he had no choice but to stop and listen to what I was saying. There was no time for his stubbornness, not when his life was so clearly on the line. You better wipe that look off of your face, and don't act like I don't know what it means. I snarled, sucking in deep breaths to calm my frantic heart. You're not sacrificing yourself. It's not an option, you hear me? I will lock you in one of these cells. If it means keeping you safe, and I'm willing to bet anything that Zeke and the others will help me. What kind of alpha would I be if I didn't do this? Maddox's voice was lower than normal, thickened by grief and guilt. More than anything, I wanted to wash it away. I wanted to be the balm that soothed his soul and the rock that the waves crashed against, but some things couldn't be fixed. I knew that firsthand, because the hole in my chest where my brother once was would never close, never heal. I hated that he had to throw my earlier words back in my face. He knew I couldn't argue against it, not when I was so willing to do the same thing. It was pure selfishness that kept me from backing him up, but as hard as I tried, I couldn't seem to change my own mind. Maddox, I'm not living a life without you in it. I won't do it. I don't care if it makes me selfish. Becoming a Luna was never something I wanted, not until I met you and realized what you are to me. If I lose you, I lose my reason for everything. Flecks of shimmering gold filled his eyes, warming my cold and clammy skin. You'd take care of this pack, I know it. You'd be alive and breathing. That's all I want. He finished, his voice filled with such absolution that a shard of panic pierced my chest. No, I wouldn't. I closed my eyes, facing the ugly truth behind my many flaws. There was such rage boiling beneath the surface, staining my soul, and turning it black, feeding the darkness that poisoned my blood. When I opened them, I let every bit of that anger show, praying it would be enough to deter him. If I lost you, I'd lose myself. The darkness would take over, and I'd let it. Maddox, I'd kill every last witch that walked this earth. I'd kill every single person that led to me losing you. Surprise and dread flooded the mate bond in cords of steel and silk, rippling across Maddox's rugged face until his guilt and grief morphed into sheer determination. The sea that was his thoughts began to churn, kicking up into a hurricane that caused the waves to funnel and whirlpool. Then there has to be another way. Rowena was far too enthusiastic telling us how to break the spell. She wants us to focus on what she said, rather than what she didn't. He said, eyes darting over to the far wall, through the window that gave us a glimpse of Rowena in her cell. An idea popped into my head, one I'd thought of weeks ago but hadn't given much thought to. It was nearly impossible, but it beat losing Maddox or someone else I loved. The smallest glimmer of hope filled my body, smoothing over the ragged edges of the hole in my chest. I couldn't embrace the emotion the way I wanted to. There was no telling if this would work. "We could kill the Blood Witch," I said after several seconds of silence. "She's the one casting the spell. She's the one trying to control me. If we kill her, then the spell is broken and the only person capable of controlling me is gone." Maddox's eyebrows slid closer together, his face pinched in a grimace. "It would work, but we have no idea where the Blood Witch is. They could be in any town, and we'd never know. Even if you found a way to break through the illusion magic Rowena was talking about, we don't have the time to go through every single human town within a 200-mile radius." He was right, but there was another option, a faster and much more satisfying one. My attention drifted over to the observation window, to where Rowena sat. Her eyes were locked on my own even though there was no way she could see past the two-way glass. Let's see how enthusiastic she is when pain is involved. While Maddox went to grab a few things, I stayed put with the others. I didn't need a cart full of instruments to peel her flesh from bone. Even without the aid of my magic, I'd much rather use my hands. Tristan and Giovanni were both leaning against the wall. Neither acknowledged the other, but they didn't seem to be fighting anymore. I hoped whatever feud they had going on had come to an end, because we needed all hands on deck to get through this. Brianna, Zeke, and Tessa were huddled around the single table in the room, exhaustion clear on all their faces. "The sun will be coming up soon," I warned both Tristan and Giovanni. "You guys might want to get out of here." "We're staying," Giovanni grunted in his thick accent, staring at me with eyes even as dark as his shadow wolf mate. Tristan nodded, still not looking at Giovanni, but said nothing. Just then, Maddox returned to the observation room, pushing a large metal cart in front of him. The blades, drill bits, and various vials of chemicals rattled as they hit one another. From where I stood several feet away, I could make out the subtle tang of old blood coating many of the instruments. "Would you mind going to check on Holly? She was at the hospital the last time I saw her," I asked Tristan, smothering the worry that threatened to shine through my eyes. It wasn't what Rowena said that had me fumbling, but the potential that my half-sister was in danger too. There wasn't a single doubt in my mind that Holly could be used by the witches, molded into a weapon of mass destruction. She'd been an object in my father's eyes, something to possess and use, and I knew that wouldn't change with the witches involved. It was one of the many reasons why I'd never asked for her help. "She's safe with Mason and Clara. They've been keeping me updated," Tristan replied, pulling a cell phone out of his back pocket. He swiped his finger across the screen and held it up for me to see. There was a text thread between him and Mason, along with several texts about both Holly and my grandma. Tristan cleared his throat, the sound somewhat awkward. Brushing away the strands of his golden hair that fell in his face, he regarded me without his usual scowl. "You need us right now, and not as your seconds in command, but as your friends," he grumbled. The pressure in the room increased, weighing on my shoulders. It was the only sign I had that told me Maddox had approached. Just when I thought he'd snap and lash out at Tristan, he surprised me by doing the exact opposite. "We need all the help we can get," he said, then gestured to the cart he'd pushed into the room. "How do you feel about drawing some blood?" I was positive I'd been devoured by the darkness and forced into an alternate universe because Tristan's slender lips peeled upwards in a devastatingly eager smile. "Are you kidding? I love blood." 5 minutes later and the floors of Rowena's cell were stained red. Staring down at the growing puddle, I silently wondered if it would seep into the concrete if we'd return to this very room a decade later to find the evidence of what we once did. I'd always known Maddox as one of those rare individuals who excelled at everything he did, and this only reaffirmed that belief. The way he moved, gliding the blade through the flesh and muscle, was nothing short of an art form. Seeing my fair share of death, I assumed that watching the man I loved torture someone would fill me with disgust and shame. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be standing here, fighting the urge to jump in and do far worse than carve off a finger or two. The dark magic I'd dabbled in tainted my thoughts and fought to express its will over my own. It was why instead of helping my mate, I stood off to the side with hands clasped behind my back. "You're going to tell us where the witches are. It doesn't matter if it's with your last, gurgling breath," Tristan said coldly, hovering over Rowena. He played the part of Maddox's partner in crime with more joy than I'd ever seen him express. I would have never pegged him as one for torture, but where Maddox was rough and brutal, Tristan was cold and calculated. They balanced one another out perfectly, keeping Rowena teetering on the cusp of consciousness. Coated in a thick sheen of sweat and blood, Rowena's head lolled to the side. Her auburn hair was matted and slicked back from her head. The flesh along her arms was gone, laying on the floor in piles that made my stomach turn. Her chest heaved, her eyes glossy with both tears and rage. "Where are they?" Maddox bellowed, slamming his hands down on the arms of the chair. Rowena jolted but did not move. Her eyes, however, tracked Maddox wherever he went. "Where is the Blood Witch?" Slowly, her lips curled into the smallest of smiles, her teeth painted pink from blood. From behind my back, my fingers twitched, every joint aching as a voice far darker than the shadows danced through my head. "Kill her, kill her, kill her. Make her pay. Make them all pay. Use us to bend them to your will. We will rule the ashes, not them." The only thing that kept me from finishing what I'd started was the stinging pain that came from biting the inside of my cheek. Blood filled my mouth, but its scent was drowned out by Rowena's. The wound healed within seconds, forcing me to bite it open a second time, and then a third. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore and feared I'd truly snap, Rowena belted out a wet, agonizing laugh that made Maddox go completely still. "You!" Rowena wheezed, the whites of her eyes bright against all that blood. "She's already here." The growl he let out was low enough to make my hair stand on end. "She's here, in my pack," Rowena hummed, lips curling at the edges. "She's been here this entire time, Alpha Maddox. Living right under your nose." There wasn't much more we could do after that. Rowena was dangling on the cusp of unconsciousness, and one more slice, one more sliver of flesh, could easily send her tumbling off the edge. I could have healed her, resealed her wounds, and sent the blood trickling back into her body, but I didn't trust myself. The more I thought about her, about Shawn and how I felt, the hazier my mind became. I was running out of reasons not to finish what I'd started back in the forest, and that fact terrified me more than anything. I should have told Maddox, but what was the point? There was nothing that could be done. The dark veins along my fingers and hands were proof that I'd almost went off the deep end, and the shadows themselves insisted there was no cure to be found. After ordering Giovanni to dose Rowena with enough hemlock to subdue a small army, Maddox and I left. We spent the rest of the day together, though it was anything but relaxing. There was so much he and I needed to talk about, but we were both working on overdrive, fixated on protecting the people of this pack. Zeke, Tessa, and Brianna tagged along, following us to Killian's old office. The five of us crowded around the large conference table, clutching cups of crappy coffee in our hands as we created lists of every single person we'd come in contact with since moving to the capital of the pack. Strangers, acquaintances, friends, family, foes. There were too many people to sort through and not nearly enough time to vet them all. Tessa, surprisingly enough, was the most helpful. She'd stepped up since declaring which side she was on and was honest with the information she gave out despite her obvious fear towards losing her sister. I don't know exactly where the others are. Ember and I were kept from the group. We were assigned a protector or a babysitter as Ember liked to call her. Elaine's one of the witches good with crafting illusions. Tessa explained, her soft features hardening at the mention of her twin. Her voice took on a muted tone as she continued, there were a couple of times your wolves didn't even notice us. We'd be camping in the forest and a patrol team would race by. Do you think that's how the Blood Witch is escaping our notice? Maddox asked from across the table. I noticed how he tried to tone down the command in his voice, but it was there, nonetheless. Tessa didn't seem fazed by that fact. If anything, from the way she tilted her chin, she seemed used to being given orders. No. If she's truly here in your pack, then she's hiding in plain sight. Surrounding herself with a bunch of protectors to hide her whereabouts, it's not really her style. Tessa cringed. It should have frightened me that the mere mention of the Blood Witch had Tessa flinching, but all I could think about was Shawn and the fact that both Brianna and Mason were meant to join him. You've met her, then? Zeke asked, his eyes brightening. They flickered to my mate, staying there for several seconds. He and Maddox were having some kind of silent conversation when Zeke abruptly turned back to Tessa and asked, do you think you'd be able to point her out if you saw a picture of her? Tessa blanched. I've met her once, but it wasn't an experience I ever wanted to relive. She was terrifying, to be honest with you. The kind of crazy that's cunning and calculated. How do we know she's not wearing someone else's face? I countered, hands clasped and resting beneath my chin. The dark veins running up my fingers made them ice cold. If the second witch can change her identity, can't the Blood Witch do the same? Again, that's not really her style. She's cocky, but not in a way that's considered a weakness. She'd thrive on the fact that she's living under your nose, but the second you came sniffing too close, she wouldn't hesitate to pack up and move on. Tessa explained, pursing her lips. The way Rowena spoke made it sound like you haven't even come close to figuring out who she is. I'd be willing to bet if she's actually here in your pack, then she's wearing her own face. If she is, I think I could point her out. It's not perfect or fast by any means, but it's a start. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to know who murdered my parents. Was it that sister of yours? Brianna chimed in, and as her voice dropped low, I swore the lighting in the room followed. Tessa visibly swallowed, glancing at the furthest corners of the room as though she noticed the sudden lighting change too. No, it wasn't Ember, not that she didn't volunteer herself for the job. My sister isn't bad, not at her core. She's just angry. Tessa sighed, her earthy eyes locked on the table's surface as though it were the most interesting thing in the world. She scratched at a speck on the surface, not meeting any of our eyes. Our parents were killed werewolves. Rogues, actually. It doesn't matter to her who you guys are or what pack you belong to. You're all the same in her eyes. The witch that murdered your parents was an elemental like Ember and I, only her element is water. Brianna's eyes narrowed. Water. Does that mean your parents drowned? Tessa said softly. I'd apologize, but what would it change? All of the apologies Ember and I received as children did nothing to bring back our parents. As the others continued to talk, their voices fading into the background, I lost myself to my thoughts. The blood witch was here in our pack, waking up each morning on our land, staring our people in the eyes whilst plotting their deaths. Did she sleep in a bed? Was it a house she lived in or an apartment? Did she hold a job to keep up the facade of a pack member? These were all things I mulled over, and the more I pictured her smiling and pretending to be one of us, the angrier I became. It came to a head when I glanced over at Maddox, seeing him when he thought no one was looking. There were dark circles beneath his eyes, and his lips were swollen from the number of times he rolled them between his teeth. Zeke, you and I can come up with a list of everyone within a 50-mile radius. We'll get pictures and have Tessa go through them one by one. If the blood witch doesn't turn up, then we'll widen it another 50 miles. Maddox declared, his posture stiff and shoulders drawn back. Tessa tapped on the table's surface, seemingly deep within thought. If you had a strong enough witch here, she could cast a location spell. You'd need something belonging to the blood witch though. The more important the object, the more accurate the spell. Her suggestion made an idea pop into my head, one I should have thought of sooner. I mentally cursed myself for being so distracted with the thought of revenge that I couldn't formulate a plan on how to get there. We don't have an object, but we have something else, something better. I mused, looking up from the table to realize that all eyes were on me. Maddox tilted his head, pride flickering in his eyes regardless of how exhausted and pained they were. You have something of hers? Tessa inquired, visibly perking up. Yeah, we do. I replied. We have her daughter. Once the idea formed, it was all I could think about. There wasn't any need for a locator spell, not when I had conjuration on my side. That, along with Holly's blood, had to be plenty to show me where the blood witch was. Even the dark magic coursing through my veins agreed with the idea, thrumming its praise as it whispered silky promises egging me on. I think we should wait until you're at full strength. I'm all for getting this BH, but you look dead on your feet. Brianna said with obvious concern. A few seconds passed when her mouth popped open, and eyes went wide. Ugh, that so wasn't the right choice of words. Snorting at how horrified my best friend looked, I shook my head. I don't know if waiting is the best idea. She has everything she needs now to finish the spell. Actually, she has to wait until the full moon tonight to do anything. Blood magic is tricky in itself, but a spell like this relies heavily on any sort of power it can consume. The full moon would be just the extra charge of power Freya needs. Tessa cut in. Shock seemed to ripple over everyone at the table, everyone except for myself. The poisonous whisper of dark magic filled my head once more, singing songs of all the other things I could do under the might of a full moon. I gave nothing away, not even when one of their tantalizing verses caught my attention and spoke to the wounded shards of my soul. So, we do this tonight? I said, glancing around the table for confirmation. Adrenaline held my muscles in its tight grip, desperate to spring. Even Maya writhed with anticipation, fighting the urge to shred my skin and start the hunt. Tonight, Maddox said, and the others quickly followed suit. For the next few hours we comprised lists and photographs of every pack member within 50 miles. With every pair of eyes I stared into, my patience waned. Tessa breezed through them, her scowl growing more and more prominent with each photograph she slid to the side. When dusk took hold and the sunlight careening through the large, open windows faded, we decided to call it quits. We filtered back to mine and Maddox's house where Tristan, Holly, and the others would soon be on their way. Deciding it was better to explain things to Holly in person, I told Tristan to keep our plan to himself. There was another plan brewing, one conjured up by the dark magic whispering in my ear. It was insanity, so much so that I didn't dare tell anyone, not even Maddox. Still, as insane as it was also highly tempting. Any guilt or doubts I had were slowly wiped away by its siren song. Even as we pulled into the driveway of the house, it was all I could think about. Tristan, Holly, and Giovanni had beaten us to the house. They were all in the kitchen, crowded around the island and sipping from the blood bags I kept stocked in the fridge. My fingers twitched at the sight of my half-sister, at the features her and I shared, ones we got from our father. I ground my teeth together, agitated and on edge. The room felt too small, too confining. This plan was weighing on my head, dangling in front of my face like a juicy piece of steak. I needed to tell someone before I did something I regretted, something I couldn't take back. "Can we talk for a minute?" I asked Maddox through Mind Link, catching his honey-coated eyes from across the room. "Alone?" He gave the subtlest of nods and excused himself from the kitchen. Together we walked throughout the house, heading upstairs and straight down the main hall. Maddox followed closely behind, his lips knitted tightly together, though I didn't understand why until I stopped in front of our bedroom door. "Oh, I didn't realize," I trailed off, staring at the door. "We don't have to go in there." "No, it's fine," Maddox replied, his voice deeper than usual. "It's not the only thing I have to face, right?" I laced my fingers with his and nudged open the door, flicking the lights on as we stepped inside. Our scent clung to every inch of the room, from the rumpled bed sheets to the closet where my clothes were strewn along the floor. There was something lying by the foot of the bed, something that caught the overhead light and shimmered beautifully. I gasped, my heart jumping at the small band of metal on the carpet. Practically diving for it, I snatched it off the ground and held it up for Maddox to see. The sheer relief that slammed my chest ached, bringing a heavy wave of tears to my eyes. "My ring," I stammered, trying to catch my breath. "I thought I lost it in the forest." Maddox's attention wasn't on me though, or the ring. He was frozen just a few feet in the doorway, his eyes locked on the exact spot where I'd lost consciousness. There were a million emotions fraying the ends of the mate bond, but they were echoes of what they should have been, remnants of what Maddox was truly feeling. I wasn't sure what spurred me on, forcing my feet to carry me his way. All I knew was that I couldn't physically to let him go through this alone. "Show me what happened," I whispered, raising my hand to guide his face towards my own. The fog cleared from his eyes, replaced with blatant refusal. "I can't let you see that side of me," he rasped, his stubble-coated jaw clenched beneath my hand. "It wasn't you that did those things. You can't carry this alone, it'll kill you. If you show me what happened to you, I'll show you my side of things. You'll be able to see for yourself that I don't blame you," I urged, a piece of my already damaged heart cracking when he closed his eyes. Please, Maddox. I can't even remember the last time I saw Shawn. Let me see him, please." Kicking the door shut behind, Maddox placed his forehead flush against my own and released a shaky sigh. Mirroring his face, I closed my eyes and welcomed the darkness behind my lids. As I released my senses one by one and slid into the familiar embrace of the mate bond, a burst of color flooded my brain. "I'm so sorry, Lola," he whispered, his voice too broken to utter the words out loud. "Please, don't hate me for what you're about to see. When you've reached the top of a great and mighty mountain, your muscles still burning from the climb, the last thing one expects is to suddenly fall." Holding Lola in my arms, her scent invading my brain and, hearing her soft sighs and the way her voice swelled with love when she agreed to be my wife, it was the highest peak I could ever hope to reach. Until bars of silver slammed down over my eyes and an inhuman force clawed itself out from the furthest pits of my mind, I had no clue that something had even been wrong. Sure, there were those moments of lost time where my memory frayed, but that had just been stress, right? It couldn't have been this creature with its spindly limbs and blood-soaked face wrapping around my body, winding around my torso, and dragging me back, further and further away until my limbs no longer responded to my will. What was this? Some distant facet of my mind found this creature, familiar in a way, but that made no sense. I roared and thrashed against its hold, but it was no use. The warning I bellowed was nothing more than an echo that lived and died in my head, never reaching my lips. Lola, my mate and future wife, the one person I dared let close, writhed beneath me with hooded eyes, so innocent and oblivious to what was happening. By the time fear and awareness seeped into her gaze, it was too late. The thing controlling my body had its limbs wrapped around me, a gash of a grin on its warped face as it made me watch. There would be no living for me if I hurt her. The moment I regained control, I'd follow her from this life into the next. I'd beg for her forgiveness and spend nothing short of eternity working to earn it. It dropped her unconscious body and headed towards the balcony, throwing us over the railing. We hit the ground on all fours, racing into the forest. Its emotions, if they could even be called that, were so different from my own that it was easy to get lost in them. There was a blatant lack of interest as it looked down at Lola, and a maddening determination for something that felt so close, yet just out of reach. Its hunger was insatiable, a craving for something more than flesh that was so consuming I feared it would attack the first person it came across. The thing used my body, tying invisible ropes around my wrists and ankles, yanking me left and right like a demonic puppeteer. I watched through my own eyes as I climbed the steps to a familiar house, every piece of my soul crying out in agony and refusal, fighting against its hold. It didn't matter, in the end. No matter how hard I thrashed, it had taken full control of my body. The violation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Each step creaked beneath my feet, the wooden porch groaning under my weight. I focused on my fingers, on how it felt to move them, but they didn't respond. The doorknob was cold in my hand, and twisted so easily, the lock snapping before it even had a chance. How could I feel the smoothness of the metal but be unable to force my body to let it go? In a last-ditch attempt to warn whoever was in the house, I cried out. This couldn't be happening, it couldn't be. Not this house, not to someone Lola cared about so deeply. The door swung open, letting out a loud creak that hung in the air even after it had faded into silence. A shadow passed behind me, one with crimson hair and pale skin. I tried to turn, feeling the muscles and tendons in my neck, but they didn't respond. I was still in the car, but my hands were no longer on the steering wheel. The monster taking over my body forced me inside slowly, one foot after another as I crossed the threshold and stepped into the small foyer. It made a point not to turn around, not to look at the person following us so closely. To the right, through a small entryway, was the kitchen. Warm light spewed into the foyer, and the distant sound of a football game on television trickled through the house. The commentators were laughing, joking over the piss-poor performance from the playing teams. One of them must have made a touchdown, because following the cheer of the crowd was another shout. This one wasn't coming from the television. It was coming from Shawn. I wouldn't give this thing what it wanted, not from Lola's brother. It could take its pound of flesh from me, but not her family. I thrashed against its hold, fighting against the spindly limbs that wrapped around my soul and latched onto it like some kind of vile leech. Its cracked smile, split across a lumpen, almond-shaped face, didn't waver in the slightest. If anything, I think it grew bigger when a second voice called out. "Quit hollering at the television. I swear, you're as bad as your dad." Grandma's chuckle twinkled throughout the house, warm even when she was scolding Lola's brother. Panic unlike anything I've ever known squeezed my throat. All of the battles, the gory fights that ended with hundreds of lives lost, didn't have a fraction of the effect that this had. I never once admitted to it, but there wasn't a person in this town that didn't care for Lola's grandmother. Even in the beginning, when Lola and I fought one another at every turn, her grandmother had been the one to see through it all. She accepted me as her grandson before I was able to even admit my attraction to Lola. My muscles clenched, arms and legs going rigid as my steps faltered. It was as though my body knew what was going to happen, and knew it was not only an act against nature, but one so vile that I'd never come back whole. This creature stripped me of everything. I wasn't a werewolf, an alpha, or anything in between. I was scared, so scared. It drove my body forward, into the kitchen where I spotted the short and slender frame of Lola's grandma. She stood at the stove, pulling a tray of cookies out of the oven. The shadow at my back moved, a flash of teeth along with crimson hair and ivory skin. Instead of shouting at the thing holding me hostage, I tried the mate bond. I couldn't feel Lola's fiery, all-consuming presence, but I had to try. I had to. "Lola! This can't be happening. Lola, baby! Tell me you can hear me. Tell me you can hear me." I panted, breaking all over again when Grandma turned to stare into my eyes. "It's not me, Grandma. This isn't me. Run! Hide! Go, go!" I shouted and shouted and shouted, but my lips didn't move. They didn't move. Grandma stood there, staring at me and not at the person shadowing my every move. "Shawn," Grandma said slowly, her eyes still locked on my own. The note of warning in her voice made me cry out, but it was just another plea she couldn't hear. "Shawn, get in here. No, don't call for him." When Shawn's face appeared in the doorway across the kitchen, his eyebrows scrunched in obvious confusion, I realized the horrible mistake he'd made and why this thing had brought my body here. Like a switch had been flipped, the pure disinterest it oozed was replaced with a thirst for death. Its teeth cracked from how hard it grinned, and with nothing more than a whispered command, my body lunged. Grandma, with all the strength of our goddess, actually threw herself in between Shawn and I. She had the fiercest look on her face, one of righteous fury and heartbreaking concern, but it was fleeting, so fleeting. The woman that had followed me into the house chose that moment to pounce, emerging in a flash of bright hair and nails, attacking Grandma before she even stood a chance. "Maddox? What going on?" Shawn demanded, seconds away from leaping to Grandma's aid. He would have, but I was blocking his way. "Run, Shawn! That's not Maddox!" Grandma yelled, her voice no longer oozing with warmth, but gurgling with blood. "Run!" There was a split second where he just stood there, his attention going back and forth between Grandma and I, unable to focus, unable to make a decision. I'd never truly thought he and Lola looked alike, but staring at him, seeing his heart shatter in his eyes, made me realize otherwise. As quickly as he dashed back into the living room, leaping over the back of the couch in a frantic race to the sliding glass door, I was already breathing down his neck. When we collided, and the ache of my claws elongating radiated up my fingers, I froze. Disbelief kept me from closing my eyes, from blocking this out the way I wished I could have. I would have given anything, my pack, my title, my land, to block the things I felt out, but I couldn't. These hands were my own, ripping into my soulmate's brother, carving open his chest until flashes of milky white bone appeared. They were as stark white as his eyes, eyes that stared into my own, that begged even when his lungs filled with blood, and he could no longer speak. "I'm so sorry." My claws sliced through his throat with ease. His skin split, unfurling like the petals of a rose. "Please, forgive me." The sticky warmth of his blood pooled in my hands. "I can't stop myself." Blood coated his face, his skin so pale, his lips still moving. "Why is this happening? Why?" His jaw grew lax, and with my claws still buried in his chest cavity, the light warming his eyes faded, vanishing far beyond the horizon where it would never be seen again. 1 second stretched into many as a soft, gurgling breath slid past his lips. His heart gave one final shudder before falling silent. What have I done? The arms of the creature that grinned over my shoulder loosened, slithering from around my broken soul. It didn't crawl back into the depths of my mind. It simply vanished. Blood roared in my ears, the silence a cacophony of screaming, of ghostly wailing that reminded me again and again and again just what I'd done. I should have thought about Grandma, about the woman that attacked her, but there was no room for anything other than Shawn's body, his torn flesh, his eyes staring into the pits of my soul even in death, reminding me that I did this. With full control of my body, I ran. Landing on all fours, my body a mass of fur, I bolted through the glass door and heard its shards raining to the floor. The pain of them slicing into my skin was dull, nothing compared to the pain inside my chest, eating away at my brain and telling me to do the most awful of things. The memories didn't start until I made it outside. As my paws hit the dewy grass, kicking up dirt, images filled my head and clouded my vision. They were old, grainy photographs with edges that blurred. With each one, the colors brightened, and shapes became sharper. Carson, the college girl whose parents Lola and I spoke to. She was running, mouth agape and eyes so wide they were mostly white. Running through the forest, swatting away every branch that blocked her path, looking back again and again and again until finally I caught up to her. It was identical to what I'd done to Shawn. Next was Judge Clint's son, just as fear-stricken as Carson even though he'd been a prick in life. Just like her, he ran. Just like her, he stared at me with his mouth agape, because who would have ever thought their own alpha would be the one to kill them? In the slideshow of blood and death, I could hear my own voice begging the thing in my body to stop, begging it until they took their final breaths and the memories faded from my mind. The images came to an abrupt stop. Color drained from my vision, but I deserved it and much worse. I swayed on my feet, realizing I was no longer in wolf form. Everything felt wrong. The way my skin covered my bones, the way the cold air hit my skin, it was all wrong. I didn't deserve to be here, I didn't deserve her. I'd become everything I hated, an alpha that killed his own pack members for it, a mate that did the one thing I could never take back or dare ask forgiveness for. Every time I closed my eyes it was there. His eyes stared at me, his face now so similar to Lola's that my mouth filled with bile. Another plume of wind hit my chest, so cold that my vision sharpened. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. Somewhere deep in the forest, but there was no telling if I was still within pack lines. All I cared about was the cliff 5 feet away. It looked over a sea of treetops and distant mountains, a scene Lola would have found breathtaking. Never in my life would I have contemplated jumping, but just 5 minutes was all it took to take everything away from me, to unravel who I was so completely that the role of alpha now felt foreign. I wanted to jump. To pay for what I'd done, and perhaps I would have, but something stopped me. A rush of untethered panic hit me square in the chest, sinking its claws into my heart the way I had done to Shawn. It was so raw that I'd almost passed it off as my own, but then I heard her. "Maddox!" Lola wailed, her voice every bit as broken as I knew mine would be, had I answered. With her voice ringing in my ears, I backed away from the cliff and slowly sank to the ground. There was nothing in his eyes but agony. Not a hint of recognition or understanding, only pain so intense that it rendered me speechless. Maddox's memories still lingered in my vision, imprinted on the back of my eyelids every time I blinked. Shawn's face covered in blood, the way Grandma stared at Maddox, seeing so clearly that it wasn't him behind those golden eyes, hearing Maddox's screams, the way every bit of ferocity and strength left him when he realized what he'd done. All of it was too much, too overwhelming, but my reason for staying strong was right here, inches away, and crumbling to dust in my hands. Tears streamed down Maddox's face, down his cheeks where they trickled off his jaw, tickling my wrists from where I cradled his head. I curled into his chest, holding his empty stare with every sob he held back. His pain and guilt were a sandstorm that tore into me, scraping away at my skin, but no matter how badly I wanted to cry out and shield myself, I held back. I'd take the pain and weather it if it meant he'd survive. How am I supposed to live with what I've done? How do you ask forgiveness for something like that? Maddox asked in a raspy voice. Before I could reply, there was a loud crash from downstairs. Some small, selfish part of me was the tiniest bit relieved because in truth, I had no clue what to tell my mate. I could only tell him I didn't blame him so many times. Even then, words did nothing to erase the kind of pain he was enduring. It filled my body with an icy, numbing fear that grew exponentially worse when I heard thunderous footsteps, followed by my dad's voice. "Where is he?" Dad bellowed. "Where is the man that killed my son?" The blood drained from my face. "Let me talk to him. He'll understand, Maddox. I know he will," I urged, hoping just this once he'd listen to me. Maddox shook his head and stood, swiping at his face angrily, though his eyes were still glossy, and the evidence still shimmered on his cheeks. When he squared his broad shoulders, I caught a glimpse of his sheer strength and knew he hadn't lost it the way he believed. "No, I won't hide from what I've done. It doesn't matter if it wasn't me. I'm the reason the blood witch can do the spell to enslave you. My body was the weapon that killed him, that killed the others," he said quietly, exiting the bedroom and leaving me to scramble to catch up. I clipped my shoulder on the corner as I raced down the hall, nearly tumbling headfirst down the stairs to catch up to Maddox. My muscles turned to lead the moment we stepped into the living room, rooting me in place under my dad's intense stare. He hadn't changed since I last saw him at the hospital. If anything, he looked worse. His eyes were bloodshot, his face tense and marred with dark circles of exhaustion. Tristan and Giovanni surrounded him, speaking in low voices that he didn't appear to be hearing. The others, Brianna, Holly, Mason, and Clara, stood off to the side. Flora hovered behind my father, and as our eyes met, I read the warning in them loud and clear. He wasn't okay, and there was no promise that he ever would be. "Let him go," Maddox said to Giovanni and Tristan. The two vampires reluctantly stepped away but remained close by. Tristan looked my way, a question burning in his eyes. I nodded ever so slightly, assuming he was asking if I was on board with all of this. I wasn't, not exactly, but Maddox needed this confrontation. My only hope was that it didn't break him, that it didn't break them both. As Maddox and my dad stared at one another, I realized both men looked irreparably broken. The light in their eyes was fractured, letting pain bleed through the cracks. Neither one looked as strong as they once had. Not Maddox, who was an alpha known for his ferocity, and not my dad, who had fought on countless battlefields and ended hundreds of lives. Two of the most important men in my life were nothing more than mere shadows of themselves. Maddox broke the silence first. "I accept whatever punishment you see fit to give me," he rasped, and I swore I wasn't the only one in the room to stiffen. The silence was deafening, as were the stares I exchanged with Brianna and Mason. Maddox didn't so much as look our way when he said with dark conviction, "No one will stop you." The tension in the room was suffocating, drawing the air from my lungs until I couldn't take it anymore. "Maddox, don't," I whispered, but my warning was cut short when my dad charged. He bulldozed his way to Maddox, a mass of muscle and writhing pain. Time slowed and my heart wailed in my chest, the gaping hole in it weeping with blood-stained tears. Maddox didn't move, didn't so much as flinch as he stood there, waiting for the blow to come. None of us, not even myself, could have anticipated what happened next. Just when the tension in the room reached its head and it appeared as though Dad was going to lay into Maddox, he did the opposite. Grabbing him by the shoulder, my dad pulled Maddox into his arms, wrapping one around his neck and the other below his arms. He was hugging him. Even Maddox was stunned, his body going stiff, harder than granite. It didn't last long, though. How could it when both of them were irreparably broken in the same way? They were two sides of the same horrible coin. Their guilt went hand in hand, as did their pain their shame. The stone-cold masked Maddox Don split in two when my dad's shoulders trembled in a poorly suppressed sob. Slowly, with the tentativeness I'd never seen him show before, Maddox hugged my dad back. I watched in silence, the hole in my chest torn open, as my mate and dad shattered entirely. There wasn't a single dry eye in the room, not even from the two vampires watching nearby. It took every crumb of strength in my wounded soul not to break down, but as I watched the men I loved reduced to tears by their guilt and grief, it became easier to rein it in. Even if we won this battle, life would never be the same. They would never be the same. It was this moment that made me realize what I needed to do. Perhaps the darkness whispering in my veins helped motivate me to make a decision, but it was Maddox and my dad that ultimately made up my mind. The plan I had brewing, the one so heinous I didn't dare speak the words aloud, was our only hope to fix the damage the blood witch had brought to all of us. I had assumed I hid my thoughts well, but there was one set of eyes that wasn't on the two men crying in the middle of the living room. Holly stared into the pits of my soul, her appearance so eerily similar to my own that it felt like I was looking into a mirror. I turned away to give Maddox and my dad, but all I could think was that she knows. Holly knows what I'm going to do. Slowly, we all migrated into the kitchen while Maddox and Dad slipped outside. My nerves were raw without him close by, but he needed this. They both did. I picked at the edge of the blood bag I was currently drinking from, mulling over how I was going to leave without everyone noticing. With tonight being the full moon and the most likely day for the blood witch to act, I needed to fix things soon. A set of eyes burned into my skin, pulling my attention away from the crimson liquid sloshing in the blood bag. I looked up, instantly catching Holly's eyes from where she stared at me from across the kitchen. Swallowing back the guilt of what I planned to do, I slipped into the living room. I had just hit the couch when Cassidy's voice popped into my head. "You there, Lola?" she asked over mind link, her voice etched with concern. "Sure am," I managed to reply, pulling from the blood bag deeply. Warmth spread throughout my limbs, but not my hands, not where the darkness stained my skin. That part of me remained ice cold. "I heard what happened." Cassidy's voice lowered to a broken whisper. "I'm so sorry, Lola." How is Maddox doing?" I bit back a sigh. "He's as well as can be expected." "That doesn't sound good." she said softly. It's not. None of this is good, I replied, swallowing the scrap of irritation that crawled beneath my skin. The urge to lash out clogged my throat, but what good would it do to rage at Cassidy? It wouldn't take away this anger festering inside of me, anger reserved for one person alone. There was a crash through the mind link, followed by a burst of obnoxious laughter and the heavy thump of music pulsing through speakers. I grimaced, not at all hiding the contempt in my voice. Are you really at a party right now, Cassidy? Not for the reason you're thinking, trust me. Her reply came quickly, with just a hint of defensiveness to it. Look, I'm not one to admit when I'm wrong, because usually I'm never wrong, but I think Maddox was right. You think Maddox was right about what? I asked slowly. I think something happened to Brandon. She whispered reluctantly. I've gone to every college party within a 200-mile radius, and believe me, it's a lot of parties. Do these college students not have anything better to do? It's like they don't have homework or exams anymore, Cassidy. I deadpanned, cutting her rant short. Right, sorry. I ramble when I'm on the verge of freaking out. She sputtered. Anyway, I've gone to over a dozen parties and Brandon isn't at any of them. From what I can get out of these drunken, no one's seen him in days. Do you think there's any possibility he went to that safe haven you and Maddox have been working on? I don't see why he would've. There's no reason for him to be there, but I suppose it's always a possibility. I frowned, glancing towards the back door where I could see the silhouettes of Maddox and my dad talking. I can go there and check if you want. I'm wasting time searching these parties and as much as I could use a drink or 12, I'm too wound up to consider it. She huffed. Let me talk to Maddox about it and I'll get back to you, okay? I lied, tapping my guilt deep down where it would never see the light of day. Cassidy sighed softly, not at all suspicious. Yeah, that's fine. Just don't forget, please. I'm seriously worried about him. I won't forget. I said quickly, then sliced the link in two. It wasn't that I didn't care about Brandon. Even though he was an obnoxious dickhead, he was still Maddox's brother. He mattered, he really did, but I had limited time and needed every spare second I could manage. If I was still standing tomorrow, still in control of my body and magic, then we'd look for him. Until then, wherever Brandon was, he'd have to wait. You're making the right choice. You have this power for a reason. Use it. The darkness in my veins sang. Its voice wasn't human, but that didn't stop me from understanding its meaning. Amid the chatter of Brianna, Mason, and the others, it became hard to breathe. Every glance they cast me stung my skin, bringing up a wave of acidic paranoia that burned my tongue and throat. Could they see I had something planned? Something that didn't involve them? I stood abruptly, earning a frown from Brianna. She took a step in my direction, her brows furrowed with concern. I shook my head, backing away. Just need some air, I muttered, slipping out of the living room and into the kitchen. Their voices continued, overlapping one another until I could no longer tell what they were talking about. I yanked open the refrigerator and found there was no more blood bags left inside. Shutting it, I turned and opened the door beside the pantry, stepping into the dimly lit garage. Two of Maddox's cars sat parked off to the side and along the far wall was an icebox where I stashed another case of blood. Inhaling the crisp scent of gasoline and machine oil, I padded over to the fridge and opened it, pulling out another dozen blood bags. A pair of small feet clicked against the floor, following me into the garage. I knew who it was before I turned around and knew whose stare would soon meet my own. Hey! I said awkwardly, shifting my weight between each foot. Holly stood a few feet in front of the door, her hair a mass of inky darkness down her back and her arms crossed over her chest. The blues of her eyes were bright, the same shade I imagined mine were. "You're planning something the others won't agree with," she stated in a low, silky voice. I cursed inwardly. Tristan had already told her about our plan to use her blood to locate her mother, which meant she knew about my other plan, the one too insane to dare speak aloud. Reining in a flinch, I steeled my spine and stared into her eyes with ease. There was a storm brewing in my chest, raging beneath my skin, but I'd never let it show. "What's it to you, Holly?" I asked, simply put. My fingers began to twitch, stinging with icy numbness. I slipped my hands behind my back, a movement Holly undoubtedly tracked. She blinked, her eyes sliding from my hidden hands back up to my face. "Let me help you." Suspicion curled in my head, carried by the seductive song coursing through my veins. I narrowed my eyes at her, disbelief staining my voice. "Why would you do that?" I pondered. She had no reason to help me, not with this. The thought of her lying to my face, turning me into Maddox and the others before I had a chance to fix this, it was maddening. Rage simmered, coming to a boil that I had to physically fight to contain. Holly lowered her voice even more, the words coming out in barely a whisper. "My blood is magic, Lola. You can use it to find my mother, but there's also so much more you can do with it. I'm your sister, and I want to help you. You deserve it after all you've been through." She's telling the truth. Let her help us. Use her power. The dark magic sang. "I'll let you help me on one condition," I told her. "We leave here, right now, without telling the others." Holly didn't so much as hesitate to reply. "Deal." It was terrifying how easy it was to use my magic now. A single thought woven with intention, entwined with a thread of energy, and reality itself bent beneath my hands. Holly and I left the garage, walking through the kitchen and into the living room where everyone had gathered. Brianna was talking animatedly to Mason and Clara, while the two vampires standing close by watched with interest. Dad and Maddox had come back inside and were now sitting on the sofa still deep in conversation. Maddox's head snapped up, his eyes locked on my face as Holly and I entered the room. There was no dark light of suspicion in his eyes, only exhaustion and endless love. He opened his muscular arms and I stepped into them, my breath catching as I waited for what might happen next. What my mate didn't know was that the girl he held in his arms wasn't real. Through one of the many living room windows, Holly and I watched the illusion I crafted unfold. Everything, from the stitching on our clothes to the part of Holly's hair, was a product of my magic. I'd taken the extra precautions to make the illusion tangible on the off chance someone was to reach out and touch one of us. Nothing would blow our cover like a hand passing through our arm or torso, proving we were made of nothing more than mist and magic. It took seconds to conjure up two clones of us, to slip through the front door without a single person in the house noticing. Without Rowena's cursed amulet around my neck, it was all too easy. It's a little unsettling, isn't it? Seeing yourself from a distance. Holly murmured in a low voice, even though it wasn't needed. Another droplet of magic and any sound we made was undetectable. The shadows themselves cloaked us outside, obscuring our forms from the window we stood in front of. I couldn't bring myself to answer her. Guilt ran rampant in my chest the longer I looked at Maddox. He and Brianna were talking to me to the illusion. Their lips moved, but I didn't dare tune into what they were saying. Forcing myself to turn away, to go against my family and friends, was the hardest thing I'd ever done. It made every breath I took sting in my lungs, but I wouldn't lose anyone else. If this power I had was so incredible, then there was no reason I couldn't do this on my own. Let's go. We're wasting time and I need to make a pit stop. I ushered Holly away from the window, compelling the shadows to follow. We jogged around to the front of the house, going down the driveway to where Tristan had parked the sedan. A tiny push of magic and the engine rumbled to life. With Betrayal roaring in my head, an acrid backdrop to the song the dark magic whispered in my veins, Holly and I peeled out of the driveway and into the night. Neither of us spoke, but I gathered she was nervous by the way she tapped out a hasty rhythm on the armrest, eyes scanning the passing forest. Peeling down the back roads brought up a time when I'd been afraid of driving. I wasn't sure when that fear had subsided, but at this very moment, I felt absolutely nothing. Blame it on the icy kiss of dark magic, or the fact that I'd been maxed out with my brother's death, but it was a break I had longed for. How long do we have to do this? Holly asked, her voice soft as it peeled past the layers of darkness. The back road we coasted down widened as we drew closer to town. Businesses began to pop up, their windows darkened, and open signs flipped to closed. Most of the parking lots were empty, except for the one I was looking for. Without me there to control them, the illusions will slowly unravel. I'd say we have an hour tops. There was no way for me to actually know this, yet I did. The answer came in the form of a kick to the gut, an eerie feeling that smacked me upside the head and demanded I listen. I made it to my first and only pit stop within 10 minutes, swinging into a bay before putting the car in park. Lola, why are we here? Holly craned her head to stare out the window, a strange note of suspicion plaguing her voice. Her brows were furrowed when she finally turned my way. Again, I didn't respond. She knew why we were here and what my plan was. I wasn't going to waste the time answering. Be back in 5. I turned away, closing the driver's side door. With a single thought the air around me folded, weaving itself over my body and erasing my form from view. To Holly, it would look like I had vanished in thin air, but I was still very much present. An iridescent film of magic only I could see floated in front of my face, encasing my body in a cocoon of energy. Without looking back, I strolled into the hospital through the ambulance's bay doors, one step closer to bringing my brother home. Nurses flitted by left and right, a sea of colorful scrubs that blurred as they passed. There weren't any more than a dozen, and while they moved with purpose they lacked that sense of urgency present when someone was teetering on the cusp of death. It seemed it was a normal night for them. For me, it was anything but. Not a single one of them looked my way. Most of them chatted as they walked, slinging medical phrases I didn't know the meaning to. More than once I had to move out of the way to avoid running into one, but I doubt they would have noticed if I had. Even the nurses sitting behind the main desk failed to notice me pass. As for the badge I snagged, one of them would be missing that, but they'd most likely chalk it up to a case of forgetfulness. 5 minutes would pass, and they'd find it in the exact spot I'd swiped it from. The morgue itself was cold, but not nearly as cold as my hands. By the time I made it to where Shawn was being kept, that iciness had injected itself into my veins and traveled to the rest of my body, encasing me in frosty stone. When I pulled his body out of the cooler, my first urge was to drink him in. To stare at the face I'd grown up besides, to think about how much it had changed during his progression from boy to man. I didn't give myself so much as a second, because this wasn't the end. Getting into the hospital was the easy part. Escaping, now that was a bit harder. With another speck of magic, any sound I made was silenced. Making sure I didn't run any nurses down with the giant metal cart I pushed, that was the hard part. I did wind up clipping a few with the comer, but the most they did was hiss in pain and turn to see nothing but empty hallway, before going back to their jobs. Lola. Don't tell me that's what I think it is. Holly squeaked as I approached the car, slapping a hand over her mouth. She fumbled to get her seatbelt off, though I wasn't sure why. I was too wrapped up in sliding Shawn's body onto the back seat to notice that Holly had cursed for what was most likely the first time in her life. Once I got him situated, I slammed the door shut and climbed into the driver's seat. Holly was turned in my direction, her eyes wide with some vagrant emotion I didn't care to process. Once again, we drove in silence. This time around, it was thick with tension. Nearly a dozen times Holly would open her mouth only to snap it shut, never once saying anything. What was there to say, after all? She knew my plan and had even offered her blood to help. There was no backing out now. Not for me, not for her. Not for any of us. All I needed was a patch of land directly under the full moon. I didn't drive far before finding the perfect spot. A cutout alongside the main road wouldn't even garner attention for most. It was unimportant, an easy detail to overlook. For me, it was everything I needed and more. Help me with his body, I told Holly, barely waiting to put the car in park before jumping out. She twiddled with her fingers, once again opening and closing her mouth. I guess she could tell I meant business because with one look at the expression on my face, she snapped out of her stupor. We set Shawn down in the grass off the side of the road. I stood over the body of my big brother, still not allowing myself to process what had happened. The gashes across his neck and chest were unimportant. His skin was almost translucent, blending in with the muted colors of the grass so well that it was both beautiful and haunting. The way the moonlight streamed down onto his body, turning him silver, was a sight I'd never forget. I'm so sorry about Shawn, Lola. I'm so sorry. Holly's shaky whisper came from behind. Her voice was swallowed by the night, stolen by the stillness that surrounded us. I sank to my knees at Shawn's side, trailing my eyes over his dark hair and long lashes. What are you planning to do? Holly asked. The clear note of hesitation in her voice prompted me to turn my head in her direction. I scowled, confused as to why she needed me to say it aloud. A chill skated down my spine, one I ignored as I looked down at Shawn once more. I'm going to bring my brother back from the dead. I couldn't look away from him. Holly gasped audibly, circling Shawn and I until she faced me. She lowered herself to the ground at his side. Her hands were trembling, and the whites of her eyes were visible, large and bright despite the darkness. Lola, you can't do that. My head snapped up without my say. Crimson tinted my vision, my fingers tingling from icy cold. What exactly did she mean by that? Yes, I can. You read the book, you know what conjuration is and what it's capable of. I can do anything. You knew this was my plan, Holly. I'm not seeing what the sudden problem is. I laughed at the absurdity, but there was no warmth, no humor in it. You read the book too, which means you saw the part where it talks about what you're tapping into to do these things. Something like this, raising someone from the dead. You know that's not the kind of power you want to tap into. It won't let you go. Even now, it's holding on to you. Her eyes full of knowing, trailed down to my hands, to the dark veins that crawled up the tops of them. My fingers twitched, joints aching, and bones grinding against one another. You knew this was my plan, Holly. I said carefully. Holly shook her head, a small, panicked laugh sliding past her lips. Lola, I thought your plan was to use my blood to find my mother by yourself. You wanted to keep your friends and family safe. That's why you left them behind. Now, this I never saw coming. She stood from the ground, towering over Shawn and me. With her hands raised, she took a step back, and then another. My fingers twitched, my brain fogging with every passing second until each thought was drenched in a thick mist that made it hard to focus. I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have agreed to help you. You need to talk to someone, Lola. I can't do this anymore. Please, just take me back. She was taking back her promise to help me with this. She was leaving me to do it myself. How dare she? We can make her. All we need is her blood. Just one tiny little drop. The dark magic in my veins sang soothingly, gliding its icy fingers over my face and neck. It was right. It had always been right. I should have never thought Holly would understand, that any of them would understand. How could she? After all, she'd been locked away by our father. Spending an entire life without anyone, without friends or family. How could she possibly understand the bond Shawn and I had? I barely registered the sudden temperature drop, or that I'd been the one to will it into existence. Lola, what's going through your head right now? Her teeth clacked together. There was fear in her voice, wafting into the air the same way her breath did. Knowing I had been the one to put it there felt good. You shouldn't have done that, Holly. I said darkly, succumbing to the siren's song oozing in my veins. Now, I'm going to have to make you. Now, you have no choice. A burst of magic exploded from my chest, spurred on by my thoughts. Holly's yelp was swallowed by the night, her body jerked forward before being brought to her knees. I held her there with nothing more than my own will, rooting her in place where she'd once been. Lola, what are you doing? Stop this. This isn't you. She begged, blue eyes bright and fearful, watering with every plea. I stared at her, and even though some distant part of me knew who she was, I felt nothing for this girl. There was only unending cold, a bitter ice that covered my soul and held it in a soothing embrace. There was no guilt, no pain, and no shame. You're wrong, Holly. I said, not recognizing my own voice. From behind my half-sister, the shadows crawled from the forest, slithering along the ground just out of sight. Holly thrashed, but I had her pinned from the shoulders down. Tears budded along her lash line before falling free. Somewhere deep beneath the ice, I felt a twinge of something, but it was just out of reach. Lola, don't do this. If you won't think about yourself, think about Maddox. Think about what this would do to him. I know losing your brother hurts, but do you think this is what Shawn would want? Another burst of magic and I wrenched her hand forward, turning it palm side, bending her to my will was addicting, spreading the silky veins of darkness further up my hands. The part of me that cared was buried too deep, and no matter how much she cried out, her voice was smothered by the beautiful siren's song. I think Shawn would want to be alive. Why don't we ask him? I mused, flicking my hand in the direction of the shadows. One leechy tendril jumped up from the ground, slashing the palm of Holly's hand. She let out a quick shriek, and the two of us watched as droplets of pure crimson began to bead along her skin. The others on the outskirts began to writhe impatiently, scenting her magical blood and wanting to drain her dry. No, you will not feed from her. If any of you take so much as a single drop, I will send you into oblivion. I snarled, forcing them back into place. With my magic, I tilted Holly's hand and allowed the blood that pooled to splatter along Shawn's chest and stomach. It was bright against his pale skin, shimmering with a magic I recognized instantly. I placed my hands on my brother's cold, hard chest. Holly's blood was searing, almost painful from how cold I'd become, but within its heat I could make out the electrical current of magic. Bracing myself, forcing Holly's pleas to the very background of my mind, I began. A single thought, a mere whisper of intention, and magic swelled in my body. Every drop, I forced into my brother's lifeless corpse. I couldn't remove my eyes from his face, couldn't stop staring, waiting for the moment his eyes opened and life returned to them. The first burst of magic I forced into him sent me spiraling into the darkness, but there was something different about it. I craned my head, looking around, but it went in all directions. There was an emptiness that surrounded me, echoing though there was no sound to latch onto. He's not in there, Lola. His soul is gone. Can't you feel it? Holly's distant voice cried out. We can bring it back. The dark magic hissed. Yes, we could. I reached out with my magic, unfurling invisible arms that spread in all directions, delving past the thin fabric that separated worlds and into realms that I had no name for, that I didn't know existed. There was this warmth, this speck of golden light that I couldn't see, but feel. Somehow, I knew it was what I was searching for. My bones began to ache from the cold, my arms growing heavy and shoulders stiff. Its influence was spreading, but I was so close. I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have done this. Holly's sobs grew louder. A prickling sensation raced up my spine, an awareness that told me someone was here. That they were approaching. I snapped into my own body, my vision returning in a burst of detail and color. Holly's blue eyes were torn in two. Sorrow, guilt, and regret poured from them in tandem with her tears. Her lips trembled, making out 3 words that would haunt me to my grave. Please, forgive me. A scuffle sounded from directly behind me, lifting the hairs along the back of my neck. I turned and my heart nearly ceased as I realized whose eyes I were looking into. You! I gasped. An excruciating pain encased my skull, stealing away my vision and the ground beneath my knees. With that face burned into the depths of my mind, I fell into the open arms of darkness and let it swallow me whole. One moment I'd been swallowed by the darkness, and the next it was nowhere to be seen. Light assaulted my eyes, carrying with it colors so vibrant they practically glowed. Sprawling hills of emerald grass woven in out of the land in all directions, topped with lush trees whose branches dipped and bowed, providing soothing patches of shade to escape in when the sun became too unbearable. Rays of glittering gold shone over everything. Over the birds as they flew, over the butterflies that darted from wildflower to wildflower. They even shone over the structures in the distance, the ones that rose up out of the ground at odd angles, with pieces that swung in the gentle breeze. Wait a second. Was this a park? I broke into a jog, racing down the hill I stood atop of. Silky threads of grass caressed my legs, gentle against my skin. The air was cool in my lungs and surprisingly sweet on my tongue. As it filled my body, my head became clearer. Drawing near, the figures that had once been blurry in the distance were now sharp and vibrant with color. A jungle gym sat to my left, one with spiral towers and a network of little wooden bridges that made it look like a child's dream castle. To the left was another tower with a slide curling around its base. A swing set sat next to it, the 4 seats swaying in the breeze. In between the structures was a network of paths, dotted with benches and water fountains. A pang of recognition struck me right in my chest, but it was nothing in comparison to the surprise that rendered me speechless when I heard his voice. Lola? It's about time. I was beginning to think you were standing me up. I spun around so fast the world blurred, colors mixing, and the air sparkling with hints of what I swore were actual magic. None of that mattered though, because the man standing before me with a wistful smile on his face was none other than Shawn. My big brother. Looking back, I wouldn't remember sprinting to him or how the scenery seemed to change, the distance between us shrinking as though the earth itself couldn't wait to see us embrace. What I'd remember was throwing myself into his arms, taking in his scent and the way his skin glowed with life and warmth. The wall I'd constructed in my heart, the one holding back every ounce of grief and pain, was obliterated the moment I stared into his eyes. I couldn't stop crying, just as I couldn't stop staring at him, clinging to his shirt and skin because who knew when this dream would end, and I'd spiral back into the real world? The shards of my shattered, broken heart slipped through my fingers, slicing my skin as they fell to the ground. My brother was gone, dead. The boy I grew up with, who was there for every single moment, was lost. Shawn took my face in his hands, smoothing away my tears and continuing to do so even when the action caused more to fall. The entire time, his wistful smile remained in place. Now, sis. This isn't the place for tears. Can't you feel it? Here, take some deep breaths. Let it wash over you. You remember this park, don't you? I had no clue what he was talking about but did as he said regardless. Swallowing a ragged sob, I inhaled deeply. The crisp air swirled in my lungs, sweet from the wild flowers sprouting in thick clusters. Some of the pain subsided, and with it came a feeling of peace. Shawn was right, I did remember this place. This was the park Mom would take us to as kids. It was where I'd go with Shawn after school. As children, we'd race to the swings and try to get as high as we could. Mom would always scold us, saying it was too dangerous, but we did it anyway. With each breath I sucked in, the feeling grew. It settled in my bones, bringing on a weightless sensation that had me looking down at my hands. My unblemished hands. I had felt the dark magic crawling up my arms, slithering over my shoulders and down my back, but there wasn't so much as a speck as I looked down. I flipped them over to inspect them further and found nothing, absolutely nothing. Shawn shrugged, a knowing smile on his face. Evil can't exist here. I snorted in his face. Only Shawn would give me a half-assed explanation like that. Part of me wondered if they'd return when I woke up. It was something I could have easily asked Shawn, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Now that its influence was gone, I realized how strong it had been, how it had tainted every thought that passed through my brain, coating in malice, jealousy, and evil. It had been corrupting me from the inside out, and I had let it. Where am I? You're dead. Does that mean I'm dead too? I asked reluctantly. After all that happened, tricking my family and friends to sneak away with Holly, only for her to betray me, to turn me over to her mother. It was all too perfect, the way I unknowingly threw Holly into her mother's arms. I'd been the one to set things up between them, thinking it would help Holly after everything she'd been through. I was the one who thought she should talk to a therapist. This entire time, I had already met the Blood Witch. How many meetings did she have with Holly under the guise of therapy sessions? How many did it take for her to coax Holly into her arms and onto her side? I couldn't be dead. This couldn't be how things ended. There was too much to fix, and a fight still left to be had. No, you're not dead. You're just visiting. Shawn explained, grinning when he caught my confused stare. Don't think too hard about it. Not many people get the chance to say goodbye. A tear slipped free as I closed my eyes. There's a good chance I might come back a second time, only to stay. I don't know what I'm doing, Shawn. I don't know how to win this. Maybe. Shawn mused. There's always that possibility. Life isn't a certainty, and anything can happen, but, he trailed off, eyes sparkling with mischief. But I have it on good authority to let you know, if you win this, if you defeat the Blood Witch, you won't be coming back here for a long, long while. I tried hard to wrap my head around what he was saying, but the thought of living a long life with Maddox by my side no longer felt like a certainty. It felt like a dream, one not nearly as tangible as the one I currently stood in. How can you know that? I demanded, pausing to sniffle. Let's just say, you've got someone looking out for you. Someone important. He winked, and I had the feeling he expected me to know who he was talking about. Now, we've got some things to talk about and not nearly enough time to do it. Tell me, how's Dad doing? As I explained to Shawn the moments after his death, the tears continued to slip free. Shawn's smile faded, his eyes growing dark and mournful. Make sure he doesn't blame Maddox, Lola. It'll eat him alive if he does, and he's not meant to come here for a long time. I don't know how, but he doesn't. I chuckled, wiping the moisture off my cheeks. It shocked all of us. He hugged him, Shawn, and they cried together. A soft smile returned to his face. Tell Dad I'm proud of him, that Mom is too. And even though it wasn't his fault, tell Maddox that I forgive him. You've seen Mom? I gasped. Shawn chuckled, glancing over to the forest's edge. Yeah, I have. She misses you, Lola, but she's loved seeing how much you've grown. At first glance, it was nothing more than your average forest, though the colors were much more vibrant. The longer I looked, the more I noticed the subtle differences that made this forest anything but normal. First of all, every bird and butterfly in the park seemed attracted to that one spot, weaving in and out of the trees, only to emerge and circle the park. The sunlight streaming down on the treetops sparkled like it had been imbued with flecks of gold. Even the air itself shimmered with magic, a kind that felt familiar yet ancient. What is that place? I asked, unable to tear my eyes away. Can I go in there? Shawn was silent long enough for me to turn my head. When we locked eyes, there was a gentleness in them that I'd never seen before. It wrapped around my heart and stole away the pain, replacing it with a longing so strong my eyes began to water. Ah, I'm afraid you can't. That's the point of no return, sis. Like I said, it's not your time yet. Someday, you will, and when you do, I'll be there waiting. I closed my eyes, fighting the wave of tears. I don't want to do this without you. Look at me, Lola. He demanded, though not unkindly. Reluctantly, I did as he said. I'm right where I'm meant to be, and I will always be watching over you, little sister. I couldn't help it, I didn't want this moment to end. I threw myself into his arms, wishing more than anything that I could will my magic to stretch these seconds into hours, into an eternity. It would never be enough. As I sobbed into his chest, not wanting to let go, something rustled within the grove. Look up, Shawn whispered. I craned my head towards the patch of magical trees, and when I saw what Shawn was looking at, my heart split in my chest. It was Kenyon, my brother's mate. He stood at the cusp of the grove, a breathtaking smile on his face as he watched Shawn and me. When he noticed me looking, he waved. When I turned back to Shawn, his eyes were brimming with joy and love, so much that I now realized what a horrible mistake it had been to try and bring him back. Finally, after all this time, Shawn had reunited with his mate. You're right, I said, but the words came out as a whisper. You're meant to be here, aren't you? Shawn tilted his head to look down at me. I am, Lola. I promise. Squaring my shoulders, I embraced every facet of the pain. Rather than shoving it down, I let it consume me. Then, like the birds and butterflies darting about, I let it all. I think I can let you go now, I said, my voice cracking. Shawn pulled me into a hug, and I held on for dear life, committing every detail about my big brother to memory. You're strong, Lola. So strong. You can do this, you hear me? You're going to change everything, and I'll be right there watching it all. He let me go, then took a step back. Walk me to the edge, Shawn asked, glancing in Kenyon's direction. Of course. I smiled, blinking to see past the tears. With our fingers laced together, something we hadn't done since we were children, my brother and I walked past the park that was once such a huge part of our childhood, and towards the magical grove that would cherish him always. We stopped right at the edge of the towering trees. The sweetest scent trickled from in between them, coming from somewhere deep within the forest. I tilted my head, registering the sound of laughter and bells twinkling in the distance. The feeling of utter peace was stronger here, so much so that part of me wanted to take Shawn's hand and follow him inside. I knew deep down that I couldn't, that when it was my time to come here, it would be Maddox's hand I held. Shawn squeezed my hand once before releasing it. This is where we part, little sister, but it's not forever. It's never forever. Abruptly, he snapped his fingers. Oh, I almost forgot. There's something I need to tell you before you go, something important. What? What's so important that you have to tell me now? I frowned. Shawn swallowed, the first and only sign of nervousness I'd seen from him since coming here. They said you need to know this before you go back, that it's crucial. I pursed my lips. You're freaking me out here. What is it? What do you need to tell me? Shawn paused. The silence seemed to stretch on for miles, far beyond the park and the magical grove we stood in front of. I wanted to ask who this they was and if they were the same person Shawn claimed was watching over me, but even more so, I wanted to know what he was going to say. I'm going to tell you the identity of the second witch. I'm going to give you her name. Before I could react, he leaned in close. His lips grazed my ear as he whispered a single name that threatened to tear the ground out from beneath my feet. I wanted to deny what he said, ignoring the truth in favor of something more manageable, but I couldn't. Perhaps the old me would have, but being tainted by dark magic left me changed in ways I couldn't quite name at the moment. Instead of disbelief or fear, I felt only determination. I wanted that future Shawn said I'd have, and I wanted it bad. I'll stop her. I'll stop all of them. I promised him, myself, and the mysterious person watching over me. Shawn's lips quirked up in a grin. I know you will. We all do. When you wake up, you're going to notice something pretty quickly. Just trust me on this, will you? He laughed, taking in my downright suspicious expression. It's a gift, all right? From someone important. Who is this person? I questioned stubbornly, planting my hands on my hips. As I looked around for this said person, I found only Kenyon and Shawn staring at me with identical looks of amusement on their faces. She has a lot of names, but the werewolves know her by one. Shawn replied with that mischievous twinkle in his eyes. For a split second, they glazed over, staring far away before returning to the present. She has a message for you. If you don't mind, she'd appreciate it if you didn't try to bring me or anyone else back from the dead again. She has a balance to keep, you know. He winked, backing into the grove. All I could do was stare at him as my brain worked to connect the dots. The magic laced within the golden sunlight rippled as he passed through it, so ethereal and pure that it felt almost impossible. Oh! From in between the trees, Shawn threw back his head and chortled at the shock on my face. The sound was enough to break the spell and send me rushing forward. I stopped at the very edge of the grove, cupping my hands to shout at him. Wait, what am I supposed to do when I wake up? How do I defeat the witches? You can't leave me with all these questions. With his arm wrapped around Kenyon's shoulders, my big brother turned and smiled at me once last time. You live, Lola. You live. There was no doubt in my mind that the place I had been was not of this world. Not only had Shawn been there, confusing me with talk of some mysterious person watching over me, but the concept of pain had been elusive and just out of reach. The peace that hung in the air, shimmering as brightly as the magic interwoven to create a place that was both real and memory, could only belong to some kind of afterlife. At least, that's what I was hoping. Pain was the first thing I felt as that place slipped away. It held my head in its strong grip, claws digging into my scalp to produce a throbbing pain that chased enter title, me into consciousness. I hadn't even opened my eyes yet and there it was. When I did manage to peel my lids back, I tried to recoil at the pale face staring out at more pain engulfed me, stinging my wrists, neck, and ankles. It blasted my mind, sapping my strength until even calling out to the shadows felt impossible. I craned my head down, staring blankly at the silver-plated cuffs that pinned me to the wall. What was even more surprising than my restraints was the fact that my hands and arms were no longer covered in inky veins of dark magic. As much as I wanted to rack my brain for the identity of this mystery being watching over me, there was someone else vying for my attention. It's about time. I thought you were dead. A voice snapped. The person staring at me from across the room came into focus. Toffee eyes sharpened, so familiar that my chest begun to ache. Only, they didn't belong to Maddox. Brandon. His name came out as a rasp, my tongue sticking to the roof of my dry mouth. My throat contracted with the effort it took to speak. When was the last time I had something to drink? I had a couple blood bags back at the house, but how long had it been since then? The one and only. Brandon was chained against the far wall in the same position, silver cuffs around his wrists, neck, and ankles. His reply was dripping with sarcasm, but beyond it I could see clearly the rough shape he was in. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his cheekbones were just a tad more pronounced. There was dried blood where the silver had previously made contact with his skin. As he fidgeted, fresh blood sprouted from raw, cracked flesh. What happened? I grimaced. It felt like I'd been hit upside the head with a sledgehammer. Every single thought was paired with a wave of nauseating pain. How long have you been here? Oh, let's see, Brandon mumbled, blowing the hair out of his face with a frustrated huff. He made a show of counting on his fingers, though I wasn't sure what for. After going over each one on his hand several times he grunted. Since that BH Ember and the other witches attacked the vamp town. That was days ago. I blanched, my stomach sinking. You've been here for that long? Yeah, I have. You wouldn't happen to have a bottle of liquor stashed on you? I tried to snort, but my dry throat refused to let the sound pass. No, I definitely don't have any alcohol on me. He leaned his head against the brick wall, glaring at the singular light hanging from the center of the room. It was nothing more than a light bulb on a thin wire, with a little string dangling from the side. The light it produced was shitty, but it was better than drowning in darkness. Fair warning, Lola. The service in this place sucks. He bellowed, thrashing against his restraints. The chains clanked against the brick, spitting out a thin plume of dust, but he was clearly too weak to do any more damage. Blood trickled from his wrists, splattering on the concrete floor. It dribbled from his neck as well, soaking into an already blood-stained shirt. When he was finished, he slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. He swiveled his head towards me, scanning me up and down the way I had done to him mere minutes ago. "You look different. How are things back home?" he asked. I swallowed, shifting in my restraints. The sting of silver split the thin skin around my wrists, and I winced as the wounds began to weep blood. They'd heal quickly, only to be torn open again. It was unfortunate that I knew how this worked. Not good. Holly's face flashed in my mind, and with it came a slew of emotions I couldn't handle dealing with right now. I'd trusted her, bonded with her, and thought of her as the little sister I'd always wanted but never had. Not only did I feel pathetic and stupid, but I also felt lost, betrayed. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. Brandon's shoulders slumped, his lips merging into a thin line. "You might as well tell me everything, considering neither one of us is leaving anytime soon." Starting off at the beginning, I recounted the moments leading up to when everything went horribly wrong. I'd expected a look of disgust when telling him about Maddox's proposal, but his face hadn't changed in the slightest. When I mentioned what happened to Shawn, that garnered a reaction. Brandon's eyes darkened in nearly the same fashion as Maddox's, but no amount of anger would coax Brandon's wolf forward with all that silver touching his skin. His time here must have permanently altered his brain, because the next words that left his mouth put me in a stupor. "I'm sorry. Your brother was a good guy." I blinked the tears away, swallowing the knot in my throat. It ached as it went down, forming a weight in my chest that wouldn't go away. "Yeah, he was." My whisper danced along each corner of the room before fading into the darkness. Brandon's eyes drifted to the floor. "I can imagine how Maddox is taking it. He's never going to let that one go. I'll spend every day of the rest of my life reminding him it wasn't his fault." "You might have to." Brandon voiced his agreement. I continued on, explaining what happened after Shawn and Grandma had been attacked. Brandon was more than angry to hear about Grandma, which was another surprise. The woman truly did make everyone fall in love with her. My heart clenched painfully at the thought of the woman I considered my second mother. She'd be so disappointed to know what I had attempted to do. When I reached the part about Rowena, that was the first time I'd seen Brandon show any glimmer of happiness. His eyes flashed with just a hint of his wolf before the color died off and the beast went back into hibernation. I shouldn't have mentioned it since I had no intention on elaborating, but I finished by telling Brandon I knew who the second witch was. "Who? Who is it?" He leaned forward in his shackles, tilting his head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Brandon opened his mouth, probably to goad me into telling him, when a sound came from beyond the heavy wooden door on the other side of the room. It sat to the left of me, far out of reach. There was a long groan, followed by a squeal from the hinges as it opened. Even in shitty lighting, I could make out that head of hair anywhere. It was an open flame streaked with golds and yellows, beautiful if not for the scowl marring the face of the person it was attached to. "Ember!" I snarled, but it wasn't nearly as threatening as it could have been had my throat not felt like I'd swallowed the Sahara. Considering there was nothing else to focus on, it was all too obvious to notice the smirk Ember tossed Brandon's way. She sauntered into the room wearing a pair of skin-tight leather pants and a low-cut blouse the same fiery shade as her hair. Propping her hand on the flare of her hip, she opened her mouth, but the only sound that filled the room was Brandon's voice. "I told you not to come back here without that pizza. All that talking you did, and you're doing a shit job at keeping me alive." Ember visibly stiffened, her entire body going rigid. Her eyes, which were a deep brown tinted red, flashed like hot coals. "And I thought I told you to shut your mouth," she hissed, barely craning her head to toss the words over her shoulder. Seeing as Brandon's #1 quality was running his mouth, I already anticipated what he'd do next. "I feel bad for any pets you've ever owned. You were the type of kid to squeeze her hamsters to death, weren't you? Seems like the kind of psychopathic thing you'd do." Digging the heel of her leather boots into the ground, Ember spun to glare daggers at Brandon. "Oh, shut up about the stupid pizza. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.